Welcome to Flowcast, a podcast from the Dominican Sisters of Springfield. We are exploring how to respond to God's call to give our lives for the life of the world, thus Flowcast. I'm Sister Beth Murphy, and today I am honored to be joined by Dr. Jon Nilson for a conversation about ecumenism during this week of prayer for Christian unity. Welcome, Jon.
Thank you. Thanks much for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. I want to give our listeners a little bit more information about you if I can.
Sure.
Jon is Professor Emeritus of Theology from Loyola University of Chicago. He long served as consultant for the Office of Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs in the Archdiocese of Chicago and was a Catholic representative on the Anglican Roman Catholic Consultation in the United States from 1984 to 2007. If that were not enough, Jon's roster of colleagues and acquaintances includes a veritable who's who among Dominican theologians. So even though we are not longtime acquaintances ourselves, we have enough friends in common to be ready to enjoy our time together. So, Jon, thank you graciously for agreeing to spend this time with us.
It's always good to spend time with Dominicans, I found.
Let's talk about ecumenism. And to get started, would you unpack that term for us and make the connections for our listeners between ecumenism and the Second Vatican Council?
Sure. Yeah, ecumenism is not exactly a word that pops up in ordinary conversation. It's really an umbrella term that covers any and all initiatives that are directed toward bringing about one visibly united Church of Christ. Um, so, as you can see from that description, it's pretty complex, multi-layered, multifaceted, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, from the beginning, from the first major separation of the churches between East and West in 1054, and then, of course, the European Reformation, separation has always been troubling and bothersome. And, there were initiatives and suggestions for somehow healing the breaches, and they never really panned out. And after uh, World War I, the ecumenical movement started up again after obviously a delay caused by the war, and overtures were made to the Roman Catholic Church, and Pius XI at that point said, "No, no. I mean, the only way the churches are going to be united again is if, in the phrase, if they come home to Rome, basically admit they were wrong, rejoin the Roman Catholic Church," which, of course, was not going to happen. Fast forward to the election of Pope John the 23rd and his summons of the Second Vatican Council. Explicitly says, the document that's specifically devoted to reconciliation, to church unity, issued in 1964, says that ecumenism, reconciliation, is one of the major goals of the council. So that was really history making as far as the ecumenical movement is concerned, and the has been sort of the central impetus. And then, of course, was given a big boost in 1995 when Pope John Paul II issued his own encyclical on ecumenism, 𝐎𝐧𝐞 𝐋𝐚𝐬𝐭
Yes, and I think Pope Francis has given it another big boost recently, and we'll have an opportunity to talk about all of those movements.
Sure.
Could you tell me a little bit about your personal journey in the ecumenical world? What grabbed your interest, and how did you end up in that field?
Well, one day in the early 1980s, I got a letter out of the blue from the Archbishop of Hartford, who had just been appointed Catholic co-chair of RQSA, the Anglican Roman Catholic Consultation, inviting me to join that particular dialogue. And I had no experience and no particular interest in ecumenism at that point, but I had gotten tenure. I was sort of approaching mid-career and looking for other opportunities, both for my own scholarship and opportunities to serve the church. So I agreed. I said yes, and it turned out to be transformative for me. Um, becoming close friends, dear friends, with Episcopalians. And I wound up actually spending a semester at the General Theological Seminary in New York, living and working with their professors and their students. So I really came to love them and love the Episcopal Church. So that was really the beginning of my enduring concerns about ecumenism.
You know, when you and I first talked about doing this podcast, you said something that I haven't really been able to forget, along the lines of the fact that while we talk about ecumenism and the unity of the church on this high level, a structural level, an ecclesiastical level, um, a theological level, but in reality, it's going to happen in the way you just explained it happened to you. Your relationship with individual Episcopalian people and your relationship to people of the church created a love for the church and a desire out of that, I would imagine, for unity. And so while we can have this theological conversation at one level, ecumenism really does often come down to relationships between people, doesn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. The Second Vatican Council's document on ecumenism seemed to emphasize the kind of high-level dialogue that you referred to, and saying, and for the rest of us folks who are non-specialists, we pray for church unity and contribute. It was left very vague, but I think we're beginning to understand that if these encounters don't take place at the grassroots level, then they remain kind of marginal to the ongoing life of the church. And consequently, if, for instance, well, I'm just thinking about an article I read recently uh, by a highly placed bishop in another church saying, what if all of a sudden all the leaders of the churches said, okay, we're all going to get together? He said that would be a disaster because people aren't prepared for it. And we need to encounter one another so we learn to trust one another and be taken up by the witness, the Christian witness of these other lives. I mean, I think that was one of the things that really promoted the cause of ecumenism. I think of the Second World War and the great Christian martyrs from other churches during that particular time made it impossible to think that the grace of Jesus Christ is not operative there. So yeah,
Mm.
absolutely, absolutely.
Um, you're helping to make sense for me of my own experience. And as I mentioned to you before, I was a child at the time of the Second Vatican Council and grew up in a parish where there was some level of excitement about ecumenism. I remember hearing the word for the first time. I was probably 10 or 12 years old, and the associate pastor, who was a really newly ordained guy, was at our dining room table and using this word ecumenism and speaking with great excitement. I had no idea what he meant, but
Hmm.
I saw it played out in our parish because we began to do things together with other churches. Some of the reticence of my parents to even darken the door of a Lutheran or a Episcopalian church seemed to start to fade away. And we began to see the kinds of relationships between churches that you're talking about, you know.
Hmm. Hmm.
Did you have any of those experiences either in your own youth or you've alluded to some of them that you've had once you joined the ecumenical dialogue, but can you name any of those ecumenical experiences?
None whatsoever when I was a kid. And in fact, my mother at one point told me a story that when I was a young boy, the Korean War was getting underway. And my mother had seen her own brother, her husband, other relatives, lives at risk during World War II, and she became very troubled by it. And she came up with an idea for children praying for peace. And she went and she had an appointment with Cardinal Stritch, who was Archbishop of Chicago at the time. And in the course of the conversation, she said, "Your Eminence, if we could have the children from all, not just the Catholic Church, but all the churches, etc., to pray for peace." And Stritch stopped her and said, "Mrs. Nilson, there are no other churches." Now,
Wow.
that was the official church's mentality at the time. It was the image of, you know, there is one way to Jesus Christ. It is the Catholic Church, and if you decide to split off from that, you've separated yourself from Christ, and you have no grounds for even calling yourself a church. So no, I have no ecumenical experience
In your childhood, in any case.
in my childhood. Yeah, it took me
And
into adulthood. Yeah.
I'm imagining that for lots of our listeners, they're familiar with that story.
Mhm.
How do we get from there to where we are today in a very much better position? What are some of the key things that happened over the decades to change that?
Well, last year was the 60th anniversary of the Vatican II document on ecumenism. And our church loves to celebrate anniversaries with new initiatives and new documents. It was pretty much silence around this particular document, I think precisely because there has not been the kind of progress that we might have hoped for. Um, I think of the synod and the way in which the preparatory documents for the synod all emphasized ecumenism, saying that our conversations, our deliberations are going to be incomplete unless we also are hearing from our brother and sister Christians. But when the national synthesis from that brought together the results of all those synodal documents, when the national synthesis document came out, ecumenism does not appear in the national document.
I
It,
did
it,
not
it,
realize that.
it's as if I mean the document is described as expressing the hopes and the desires and the major concerns of the U.S. Catholic Church. It's very telling that ecumenism is not in there, and I think there are a lot of reasons for that. But the fact remains, we are pretty far behind, I think, the rest of the church, and we still have a lot of work to do. But it's enjoyable work. It's enjoyable work. These encounters, you learn a lot. You meet some great people.
Hmm.
You meet, uh, and
You
the
know what I'm
ecumen.
thinking of? And I'm imagining that there have to be so many families that have what, when I was a kid, used to be called mixed marriages. And that meant marriage between someone who was Catholic and somebody who was some other Christian faith.
Hmm.
I have a sister-in-law who's Methodist. I know other friends who are in Christian and Jewish relationships. Do those not mean anything to us?
Well, funny you should ask. I directed a dissertation, and my student wrote precisely on this interchurch marriages because he had worked as a pastoral minister up in Wisconsin. And so many couples came to him in precisely that situation, a Catholic and a Christian non Catholic partner. And so he wrote his dissertation on it. He continues to work on it. He's one of the national experts on it now. A week ago, yesterday, I had lunch with one of my favorite Dominicans, Father Tom O'Mara, who is retired but lives at a Dominican parish. And he said, over meals, these priests from the parish are talking about, what about this situation, that situation? Exactly, these interchurch families that uh, are working out the dynamics of their own relationship and are seen as sort of marginal to the life of the church rather than gifts to the church. because in a sense they're living out ecumenism. They're showing what it's like to maximize the possibilities of unity, even though the institutions are still separate. As my student likes to say, it's not the couple's fault that the churches aren't together, it's the church's fault that they aren't together.
Correct. And I just keep thinking that that's the grassroots at which it needs to happen. We did a podcast, I think our first season, with a woman who worked for us, was working with us at that time. And her mom and dad were from two different traditions. Her mother from the Lutheran tradition and her father from the Catholic tradition. They were quite young when they got married, and to hear Veronica talk, this is how the discussion went before the marriage when it came to religion. They were very young, and they just went about things in their youthful way. So they decided before they got married that if they had children, any girls would be raised in the mother's religion and any boys would be raised in the father's religion. So as a consequence, she was raised Lutheran and her brother was raised Catholic and went to our high school here in Springfield. So that family, however they worked it out, it worked for them.
Mm-hmm.
They're all practicing their faith and very active in their churches.
Oh.
So it is possible that those kinds of relationships are kind of the foundation on which ecumenism builds, and I hope we don't lose that sense.
I don't
Um,
have the statistics, but the statistics are, I remember hearing them, they're quite surprising. The percentage of marriages of Roman Catholics to people of another Christian tradition or of another religious tradition. It's a major, major issue. And the sense is we are not welcoming and supporting those families in the way in which we should be.
mhm. Yes, and I think you're right. You will be familiar with this, I think. I believe it is St. Patrick's Church in Chicago,
Oh,
because
yes.
there are so many Catholic Jewish relationships, marriages
Hmm.
in that congregation, that they actually have developed a special catechetical program for the children of those.
Yes, absolutely.
So
Yes,
that's a model.
that's my home parish, and Father Jon Cusick is a good friend of mine. Instrumental in getting that going. Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely.
Hmm. I've been doing a little bit of research since you and I first started talking about the possibility of this podcast, and I found reference to a quote from Pope Francis regarding the Anglican Catholic summit that apparently happened a year ago. And this is from an America magazine article, and I'm just going to quote directly from it. It says that Pope Francis believes that by walking together, praying together, and working together wherever possible, friendships can be built between the leaders and members of different churches that not only give an important Christian witness to the world, but also make it easier to address the theological obstacles to Christian unity. Um, and I think that that phrase, especially walking together, for any of us who've been paying attention to the Roman Catholic Church's synod on synodality,
Hmm.
that's exactly what synodality is, walking together.
Hmm. Hmm.
Do you see the synod as having any possibility of helping us in the United States kind of reignite the ecumenical spirit here?
Well, the ecumenical movement has also been described both by theologians and by John Paul II himself as a matter of a gift exchange. That is, traditions and people from different traditions learn about each other. They see things in the other tradition that move them, that inspire them. And the synod is quite clear about our church learning about how to do synodality from these other churches for whom church life is inconceivable without synodality, without wide participation and wide consultation. So they can help us to understand that this is not sort of a magic wand that's going to magically convert the church into the kingdom of God on earth, but enable us to understand what pitfalls there might be ahead, as we pursue synodality. And likewise, perhaps our notion now of conversations in the Spirit might help those churches to sharpen their own practice of synodality as well. So I think
Mm.
the synod provides a terrific opportunity. I'm hoping here in Chicago that we can bring a number of people from other churches together to sit down and read through the final synod document together, because obviously, its impact on our church, but impact on other churches as well, to the extent that we carry out that agenda. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's a matter of letting things happen in a more or less organic way, so that where we can work together and walk together, we should. And wait until the moment when those things that are roadblocks and that stand in our way fall away. We can't fix those automatically. Questions about the sacrament of the Eucharist, for example, are stumbling blocks in some places. The supremacy of the Pope is a stumbling block.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This
But
goes.
you go ahead and answer that in
No, no. I
response
was,
to
I
that.
was just going to say this. This goes back to a meeting of the Faith and Order Commission back in 1952. And they came up with what's become known as the Lund principle, because they met in Lund, Sweden. And I don't have the direct quote, but he said, but the document says something like, shouldn't all the churches now be ready and eager to do everything together that's possible, except for
Mhm.
those things where conscience, absolutely forbids it. But it maximize the opportunity. The question we should be asking is, why aren't we cooperating more, on issues of common concern? Why
Mhm.
aren't we doing that? We have some bad habits to overcome.
Yes, and I think, we get in our little ruts, don't we? And we forget about those things.
Sure, sure.
When I was a young sister, I became the communications director for the Diocese of Springfield, Illinois, where I am. And um, one of the challenges that I saw it as a challenge, was to help the four bishops who lived here in Springfield to communicate the story of their relationship. So this is the diocesan see for the Roman Catholic Church,
Hmm.
for the Episcopal Church in the United States, the Lutheran Church, and the Methodist Church. And so the man who was bishop of our diocese at that time was raised himself in an interfaith home. His mother was Lutheran and his father was Catholic. And he started a dialogue with these other three bishops. Once a month, they would gather, usually at the, as he put it, usually at the Catholic cathedral, because he was the only one of them without a spouse, that they didn't have to worry about waking up early in the morning. But they would meet early in the morning for breakfast once a month. And I spoke with the communications directors of the other three congregations, attempting over a period of years to get them to agree to a news article and a news release about their relationship. And they were very reluctant, but we finally won the day. And the article was published just about the same time that a new Episcopal bishop was being appointed for Springfield. And as it happened, we ended up hosting his consecration ceremony in our cathedral. The two cathedrals are on the same street in Springfield, a matter of blocks apart. But because his cathedral was not large enough to hold the crowd, his consecration was held in our cathedral. And thus, his communications director and I ended up doing a lot of work in planning for this effort. And in the course of my conversation with his communications director, he explained to me, this was Bishop Peter Beckwith, was the man who was incoming to the diocese at that time, that the very day that Bishop Beckwith learned that he was to come to the diocese, the Episcopal Diocese of Springfield, this news release that we had sent out ended up being picked up on the wires, and it was in their local newspaper. I believe, if I remember correctly, he was in Ohio. And the Catholic priest down the street saw the article in the Ohio newspaper that very day and came running to his office with this, saying, look, this is where you're going to be going. You know? And I just, that kind of energy, that kind of life and joy in the faith that we share
Mhm.
has become very important to me.
Hmm.
And I think it's what I hear you saying is we are not where we could be in the United States, and I'm sad for that.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
perhaps the synod will give us a little impetus to move forward.
Absolutely. I hope so. I would hope so. I would hope so. Yeah, the one of the my I prayed with I mentioned the semester I spent at the General Theological Seminary in New York. So of course I prayed with the students as much as I could and became familiar with the Book of Common Prayer. And there's a wonderful prayer for the unity of the church in there by authored by an Episcopal rector in New York, William Reed Huntington, who had become really good friends with a nearby Roman Catholic priest. And his prayer begins, Lord, help us to lay seriously to heart the great dangers we are in by our divisions. And I
Mm.
think that that sentence alerts us to what are we missing? You know, what what kind of um, what kind of dangers have we gotten so used to that we don't even notice that they are dangers? I mean, there's the gospel, Jesus saying, you know, I wish all to be one so that everyone will know that you are my disciples. Well, so we're used to living in separation in a way that Jesus is saying cripples the mission, but we're used to it. You know, that's a danger. That's more than a little problem.
Thank you for pointing that out. It leads me to want to ask this question. Does the unity of the Christian church require uniformity?
Absolutely not. And I think the proof of the pudding there is our own church. There's tremendous diversity, you know, within our own church. There are other traditions that are connected with Rome, that belong to, you know, are part and parcel of the Roman Catholic Church, but very different from the kind of Western Irish Christianity that we're used to in this country. Um, I mean, I think that's one of the tasks of the ecumenical movement, to discern what is essential and what is variable. And I think, I mean, this year, as you well know, we're observing the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. And that's so important ecumenically because that's a statement of what binds together so many churches. Um, the World Council of Churches has actually, you know, produced, had a whole study process asking, is the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed perhaps a sufficient basis for unity? Would that be enough? And we would understand that everything else would be variable in certain ways. So, yeah, definitely diversity, but the question is always then what's diverse and what's essential, you know? And there are, of course, different opinions on that one.
Yes, I think that's true. I'm taking some hope from something I read in the final synod document. And I won't be able to quote you the number or quote directly, but what I recall reading in that document is the idea that not every diocese within our own communion needs to be in lockstep with every other diocese or every other local church.
Hmm.
That in itself is a kind of variability
Hmm.
that gives me great hope. For example, um, we have sisters in Peru, and we're very aware here in my own community of how much further ahead the Peruvian church is in integrating a synodal church. So, in addition to the Episcopal Conference in Peru, they also have, I don't remember the name for it, but they have another body that meets that involves lay people and religious men and women from all over the country. And they meet in synod to make decisions about the future of the church in Peru. Now,
Hmm.
their miles ahead of us here in the United States, but that doesn't mean we're not part of the same church.
Right,
We
right,
still are.
right,
So if we can recognize that variability within our own traditions, then maybe that will open us up to be a little more welcoming to people of other Christian traditions as well.
right. And I think we will be the more open to that variety, the more we have encountered them and really met them as believing, faithful Christians like us who may have a different opinion about one thing or another.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So we can hope for the best
Right,
and pray
right,
for the best and work for the best.
right. If every parish priest would call up the Christian church nearby and say, "You're Christian, I'm Christian, let's have a cup of coffee," at least start that way. We don't, we I think we have all the high level documents that we need at this point. We need to get very intentional about building our grassroots relationships.
Yes, I think that could make the difference right there.
Hmm.
Do you have any particular ways that you're observing this week of prayer for Christian unity? Any events that you're attending?
There are a number of events. I live kind of far out of the city at this point, so traveling in January in Chicago is is always an iffy thing. But one thing I want to pay attention to more is the element of racial justice in the whole ecumenical movement. Um, there's going to be no visible unity of the churches until we sort out the racial issue that
Mm,
is our country's original sin. And the African American churches, I think, are quite right in feeling why should we join up with these churches that haven't even recognized the sin, much less wholeheartedly committed themselves to doing something about it. So I think I think that will be my emphasis during the week of prayer for Christian unity. It's linkages with racial justice.
yes, and I think that is an essential element uh, that is also easy to forget.
Oh,
When
yeah.
when we think about the Anglican Communion or the Lutheran Catholic dialogue, you
Hmm.
know,
Hmm.
we're not picturing African American Christians,
No, we're not. We're not. No.
and we're not remembering that they're equally our brothers and sisters in faith,
Mm,
and in many ways doing some amazing work.
absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
I was recently at a meeting of the Greater Springfield Interfaith Association that was hosted by Grace United Methodist Church on the east side of Springfield. The pastor is Reverend Carrie Beckwith. It's an African American church, and I was bowled over by what he was telling me. His congregation were doing to contribute to the well being of the people who live in their neighborhood. And he is already deeply in dialogue with some of the other more traditionally white or diverse congregations in the city.
Mm,
And that is a tremendous witness that we could all
yes.
learn from. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
But it's a painful and sometimes difficult conversation to have
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because it requires an awful lot of humility on the part of us people who are white and have
Right.
traditionally been the oppressors.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Well, blessings on your week of prayer for Christian unity, and
Thank
thank you
you. On
so
your
much for the
on yours
conversation.
on yours too. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Flowcast. This episode of Flowcast with Dr. Jon Nilson has been a conversation about the week of prayer for Christian unity. I've learned a lot and enjoyed the conversation and have taken much renewed energy for the work of ecumenism in our church. If you'd like to know more about what we've discussed today, you can check out the show notes in our Flowcast website. That's flowcastlisten.org. And there you'll also be able to subscribe to the podcast. So, on behalf of my Dominican sisters and all of us here at Flowcast, we wish you a very happy week of prayer for Christian unity. and a time of blessing for you and your family.